The crack of a gunshot echoed through the still morning air as Abigail Rose watched the last bit of dirt fall upon her husband's grave, her trembling fingers clutching a folded notice of debt that seemed heavier than the wooden coffin they'd just lowered into the ground. The year was 1878, and the small town of Hachita, New Mexico, was as unforgiving as the desert that surrounded it, especially to a woman who had just become both a widow and the inheritor of debts that could swallow her whole. "My condolences, Mrs. Rose," Sheriff Tanner said, removing his hat as the last of the mourners dispersed from the hillside cemetery. "Thomas was a good man." Abigail nodded, her throat too tight for words. Thomas had been a good man, a dreamer with ambitious plans for their ranch. But those same dreams had driven him to borrow more money than they could repay. Now he was gone, taken by a fever that swept through town with the spring winds, leaving her alone with their 6-year-old daughter, Emma, and a mountain of debt that loomed larger than the distant San Luis Mountains. "If there's anything you need," the sheriff continued awkwardly, "you just let me know." "Thank you," Abigail finally managed, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. At 27, she was too young to be a widow, yet here she stood. "But unless you can make $5,000 appear from thin air, I don't think there's much anyone can do." The sheriff's grimace told her all she needed to know. $5,000 might as well have been $50,000 in Hachita. The bank would come for the ranch soon enough, and then what? She had no family to turn to, nowhere to go. "Mama," Emma's small voice broke through her thoughts. The little girl looked up at her with Thomas's blue eyes, confusion and sadness making them seem too old for her young face. "Are we going home now?" "Yes, sweetheart," Abigail said, forcing a smile. She wouldn't burden her daughter with the knowledge that home might soon be nothing more than a memory. "Let's go home." The ride back to the ranch was silent save for the creaking of the wagon wheels and Emma's occasional sniffle. Abigail's mind raced with calculations and possibilities, none of which ended with her keeping the ranch. The bank had given her 2 months, a courtesy they'd called it, before they would foreclose. 2 months to somehow earn enough to at least make a dent in what they owed. As they crested the hill that overlooked their property, Abigail's chest tightened. The Rose Ranch sprawled before them, 200 acres of potential that Thomas had never fully realized. The house was modest but sturdy, the barn in need of repairs, and the cattle pens mostly empty. Thomas had been forced to sell most of their livestock to cover his last loan payment before falling ill. "Mrs. Rose," the call came as they pulled up to the house. Abigail squinted into the setting sun to see Mr. Hollister, the bank manager, riding toward them on his pristine white mare. Her stomach sank. She'd hoped for at least one day to grieve before the vultures began to circle. "Mr. Hollister," she acknowledged as he reached them. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." "I apologize for the intrusion on such a day," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but I've come with an update regarding your situation." "Our situation?" Abigail helped Emma down from the wagon. "You mean the debt?" "Yes," he cleared his throat. "It seems I made an error in my calculations. The total sum owed is actually closer to 7,000, not 5. The world seemed to tilt beneath Abigail's feet. "That's impossible. Thomas kept records, I've seen them." "Interest compounds, Mrs. Rose. And there were several smaller loans your husband took out that you may not have been aware of." Hollister's thin lips curved into what might have been meant as a sympathetic smile, but looked more like a grimace. "I'm afraid the 2-month extension still stands, though." Abigail wanted to scream, to rage against this man and his numbers, but Emma was watching her with wide, frightened eyes. "Thank you for the information, Mr. Hollister. Now, if you'll excuse us, we've just buried my husband." The banker nodded stiffly, tipped his hat, and rode away. Abigail watched him go, a cold feeling of dread settling in her stomach. "Mama, why was that man here?" Emma asked. Abigail knelt down to her daughter's level. "Just business, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. Now, how about you go inside and wash up? I'll start on supper in a minute." Once Emma was inside, Abigail let her shoulders slump. $7,000. It might as well have been $1 million. She looked around at the land that had been her home for the past 8 years, trying to imagine leaving it. She couldn't. This was where she and Thomas had started their life together, where Emma had taken her first steps, where the sound of approaching hoofbeats snapped her out of her thoughts. Not Hollister again, surely. But the figure approaching from the west wasn't the banker on his white mare. This rider sat tall on a dark bay horse, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. As he drew closer, Abigail saw that he was a stranger, a man in his early 30s perhaps, with the lean, weathered look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. His clothes were dusty from the trail but of good quality. A cowboy, but not one of the cowhands who occasionally passed through looking for work. "Evening, madam," he called, reining in his horse a respectful distance away. His voice was deep with a slight drawl that suggested he might be from Texas originally. "I don't mean to intrude. Name's Matthew Lawson. I was hoping to speak with Thomas Rose about a job." The mention of her husband's name sent a fresh wave of grief through Abigail. "I'm afraid you're too late, Mr. Lawson. My husband was buried this morning." The man removed his hat immediately, revealing thick brown hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the scar that ran along his jawline. "I'm sorry to hear that, madam. My condolences to you and your family." "Thank you," Abigail said automatically. "If you don't mind my asking, what kind of work were you looking for?" she asked, surprising herself. What did it matter now? The ranch would be gone soon enough. Matthew Lawson studied her for a moment, his eyes a striking green that reminded her of the rare summer rains seeming to take in more than just her question. "I heard Thomas Rose was looking for someone who knew cattle," he said. "I've been working ranches since I was 14 and I'm good at what I do, was hoping to settle somewhere for a while." Abigail almost laughed at the irony. "Well, Mr. Lawson, you've certainly come to the right place if you're looking for cattle work. Unfortunately, we're down to just 20 head, and I won't be able to keep them much longer." His brow furrowed. "Pardon me for asking, madam, but is the ranch in trouble?" The directness of his question should have offended her, but something about his manner, respectful but straightforward, made Abigail answer honestly. "My husband left some. Financial matters unresolved. I have 2 months to come up with $7,000 or the bank will take everything." Matthew whistled low. "That's a considerable sum." "Yes, it is." Abigail straightened her shoulders. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Lawson, I need to see to my daughter." He nodded, replacing his hat. "Of course, again, my sympathies, Mrs. Rose." He turned his horse but then paused. "If you don't mind, I'd like to come back tomorrow. Maybe take a look around, see if there's anything I can do to help." Abigail was about to refuse what could this stranger possibly do, but found herself nodding instead. "If you wish, Mr. Lawson, though I don't see what good it will do." "Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can spot opportunities others might miss," he said with a slight smile that transformed his serious face. "Good evening, Mrs. Rose." As he rode away, Abigail watched him go with a mix of confusion and the faintest spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She quickly squashed it down. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Still, as she turned to go into the house, she found herself wondering about Matthew Lawson and why he'd want to help a failing ranch and a widow he'd just met. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a brief respite before the New Mexico sun would turn the day hot and dusty. Abigail had slept poorly, her dreams filled with faceless bankers and endless stacks of debt notices. She'd risen before dawn to check on the cattle and was surprised to find the water trough already filled and fresh hay spread in the feeding area. "Morning, Mrs. Rose," came a now familiar voice. Matthew Lawson emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hope you don't mind. Figured I'd make myself useful." Abigail stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You came back," said I would, he replied with a slight shrug. "Been up since dawn." Your pump needs some work, and that fence on the south side won't keep a determined calf in, let alone a full-grown steer. Mr. Lawson, Abigail began, finding her voice. I appreciate the help, but as I told you yesterday, this ranch is as good as gone. I can't afford to hire help, and even if I could, there's not enough work here to justify it. Matthew leaned against the corral fence, studying her. Begging your pardon, madam, but I disagree. This is good land with good water. The buildings are solid if a bit neglected. And those 20 head you've got left are quality stock Herefords crossed with Longhorn, am I right? That's good breeding for this territory. His assessment was accurate, which only confused Abigail more. That may be, but good land and 20 cattle won't generate $7,000 in 2 months. Maybe not, he conceded. But it's a start. And I don't need wages, Mrs. Rose, just a place to bunk and meals. I've been on the trail a long time and I'm looking to stay put for a while. Why here? She asked bluntly. Why help us? You don't even know me. Something flickered in his eyes, a memory perhaps, or a shadow of something deeper. I knew your husband, actually. Not well, but we crossed paths a few times when I was driving cattle through these parts. He spoke highly of you and this ranch, said it was the best decision he ever made settling here. The mention of Thomas and his love for their ranch made Abigail's throat tighten. He did love this place. Then let me help you keep it, Matthew said simply. I've got experience, Mrs. Rose. More than just with cattle. I've worked every job there is on a ranch, and I've helped turn around more than one failing operation. Abigail wanted to refuse. Pride and suspicion warred with practical necessity, but what choice did she have? I can't pay you, she repeated. I'm not asking for payment, he insisted. Just a chance to help. If I can't make a difference in a week, I'll move on, no hard feelings. A week, what could it hurt? All right, Mr. Lawson, 1 week, but I don't want charity. The corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile. No charity, madam, just honest work. True to his word, Matthew Lawson worked from sunup to sundown that day and every day after. He mended fences, repaired the leaky barn roof, and tended to the cattle with a skill that spoke of years of experience. By the end of the first day, Abigail had to admit he was the hardest worker she'd ever seen. Emma took to him immediately, following him around whenever Abigail would allow it, peppering him with questions about the cattle and his travels. To Abigail's surprise, Matthew answered each question with patience, never talking down to the girl or dismissing her curiosity. Mr. Matthew says he's been all the way to California, Mama, Emma reported excitedly at dinner on the 3rd night. He's seen the ocean, is that right? Abigail glanced at Matthew, who was focused on his stew, which, to her private satisfaction, he'd complimented as the best he'd had in years. Yes, madam, he confirmed. Worked on a ranch near San Diego for a spell, beautiful country but not like here. There's something about New Mexico that gets under your skin. Papa used to say the same thing, Emma said, her voice dropping slightly at the mention of her father. He said New Mexico had magic in the dirt. Matthew's eyes met Abigail's over Emma's head. Your papa was a smart man, Miss Emma. I think he was right about that. Later, after Emma had gone to bed, Abigail found Matthew sitting on the porch steps, whittling a small piece of wood by the light of the moon. She likes you, Abigail said, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she sat beside him, maintaining a proper distance. She's a good kid, Matthew replied. Smart, too, got her mother's spirit, I imagine. Abigail smiled despite herself, and her father's curiosity. Thomas was always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked and why. Her smile faded. It's what got us into this mess, I suppose. He wanted to expand too quickly, took too many risks. Matthew was quiet for a moment, his knife pausing in its work. Dreams are important, Mrs. Rose. Without them, we're just getting by. Dreams don't pay debts, she said more sharply than she'd intended. No, he agreed, they don't, but they give us a reason to try. He resumed his whittling. I've been thinking about your situation. There's a cattle buyer coming through Santa Fe next week. High-quality breeding stock can fetch a good price these days, especially with the railroads expanding east. Abigail frowned. We only have 20 head. Even at top dollar, that won't come close to what we need. No, but it could be a start, and there's more than one way to make money on a ranch. He turned the piece of wood in his hands, examining his work. This is good land. You've got water which is worth its weight in gold out here, and you're close enough to town to offer services that might be valuable. What kind of services? Abigail asked, intrigued despite herself. Well, for one, that old bunkhouse could be fixed up as a way station for travelers. Hachida's growing, and there'll be more people passing through. Charge for a bed and a meal, maybe stabling for horses. He pointed toward the distant hills. And that stream on your property, have you ever panned it for color? Color? You mean gold? Abigail almost laughed. If there was gold on this property, Thomas would have found it. He checked every inch of this land. Matthew shrugged. Maybe not gold, but there might be other minerals worth something. This territory's full of surprises. He finished his whittling and held out the small wooden figure to her, a perfectly carved horse, its lines flowing and natural. Abigail took it, running her finger along the smooth back. This is beautiful. Just a habit, he said modestly. Keeps my hands busy. You're full of surprises, Mr. Lawson, he smiled, and for the first time Abigail noticed the small dimple in his right cheek. Most people are, Mrs. Rose, you just have to take the time to find them out. The week passed quickly, and Abigail found herself increasingly relying on Matthew's advice and assistance. He seemed to know exactly what needed doing and the best way to do it. By the time the 7th day arrived, the ranch looked better than it had in months. Fences mended, barn repaired, cattle healthier and more settled. But the debt still loomed, a shadow that no amount of hard work seemed able to dispel. Abigail had begun to make peace with the idea of losing the ranch, focusing instead on what she and Emma would do afterward. Perhaps they could move to Santa Fe, where she might find work as a seamstress or cook. On the morning Matthew was supposed to leave, Abigail rose early to make him a proper breakfast as thanks for his help. She was surprised to find him already in the kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. "You're up early," she observed. "Got a lot to do today," he replied, pouring her a cup of the strong, dark liquid. "If you're still agreeable, I'd like to take those 10 best heifers to Santa Fe tomorrow. That cattle buyer I mentioned will be there, and I think we could get a good price." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were moving on today." Matthew looked uncomfortable for the first time since she'd met him. "About that, I've been thinking it might be better if I stayed on a while longer. There's still a lot to be done around here, and with that debt hanging over your head, you could use an extra pair of hands." Abigail studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Mr. Lawson, why are you really here? And don't tell me it's because you knew Thomas or because you want a place to stay. There are plenty of ranches that could use a man with your skills, ranches that could actually pay you." Matthew set his cup down and met her gaze directly. "Fair question, Mrs. Rose. Truth is, I've been drifting a long time. Worked on more ranches than I can count, driven cattle across half the territories, never stayed anywhere too long because nothing ever felt right." He glanced around the small kitchen. "But this place, there's something about it and about you and Emma." His honesty caught her off guard. "Me and Emma, you're fighters," he said simply. "Most women in your situation would have given up already, taken whatever offer the bank made and moved on, but you're standing your ground. I admire that." He looked down at his hands. "And maybe I'm tired of drifting. Maybe I want to be part of something worth fighting for." Abigail felt her cheeks warm. No man had spoken to her with such candor since Thomas, and certainly not with such appreciation. "Mr. Lawson, Matthew," he corrected gently. "If I'm staying, seems we should be on a first-name basis." "Matthew," she conceded. "I appreciate your help truly, but I can't ask you to take on my problems." "You're not asking, I'm offering," he countered. "And I have a plan if you're willing to hear it." Curiosity won out over pride. "I'm listening." He outlined his ideas with the precision of a man who had given them considerable thought. Selling the best heifers now for breeding stock would bring in immediate cash. Using that money to buy cheaper cattle from struggling ranchers further south, then fattening them on the good Rose Ranch grass before selling at a profit. Fixing up the bunkhouse for travelers, offering meals and lodging. Hiring themselves out for cattle drives when they came through the area. "It's not a quick fix," he admitted when he'd finished, "but it could work given time." "Time is the one thing I don't have," Abigail reminded him. "The bank wants their money in 7 weeks. Then we negotiate," Matthew said firmly. "Show them you have a plan that the ranch can be profitable again. Banks don't want land, Mrs. Rose. They want their money back. If they see you have a way to pay them, they might extend your time." It was a long shot, but it was more of a plan than she'd had before. "All right," she said finally. "But we do this as partners. If when the ranch starts making money again, you get a fair share." Matthew's smile was warm and genuine. "Partners it is, Mrs. Rose." "Abigail," she corrected. "If we're partners, it seems we should be on a first-name basis." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Matthew and Abigail drove the 10 best heifers to Santa Fe, where, true to Matthew's prediction, they fetched a good price, not enough to make a significant dent in the debt, but enough to implement the next phase of their plan. They traveled south to a drought-stricken area where ranchers were desperate to sell cattle they couldn't feed, purchasing 30 head at a fraction of their worth. It was a risk, as the animals were thin and stressed, but Matthew assured Abigail that with proper care they would recover and be worth double or triple what they'd paid within months. Upon returning to the ranch, they found Emma being looked after by Mrs. Prescott from town, who reported that several travelers had stopped by asking about lodging. "Told them to come back in a week," the older woman said. "Figured by then you might have that old bunkhouse fixed up proper." Matthew set to work immediately, reinforcing the bunkhouse's foundation, patching its roof, and building simple but sturdy bunks. Abigail, meanwhile, cleaned and prepared the space, sewing new mattress ticks and curtains for the windows. Working side by side, they transformed the abandoned building into a comfortable, if basic, lodging that could accommodate up to 8 travelers. Word spread quickly. Hachita was growing as a stop on the route's west, and the Rose Ranch's location made it an ideal resting place for those traveling to or from the town. Within 2 weeks, they had their first paying guests, a family of 4 heading to California and 2 prospectors bound for the hills to the north. The extra income was modest but steady, and it allowed Abigail to start setting aside money for the debt. Still, the numbers were daunting. 6 weeks after Thomas's death, with just 2 weeks remaining before the bank's deadline, they had managed to save only about $1,500, far short of the $7,000 they needed. "We need to talk to Hollister," Matthew said one evening as they sat on the porch after Emma had gone to bed. It had become their ritual, this quiet time when they could discuss the day's work and plan for tomorrow. "Show him what we've accomplished, ask for more time." Abigail sighed, leaning back in her chair. "He won't give it. He's had his eye on this land for years. Thomas always said Hollister wanted to sell it to some Eastern investors who are looking to consolidate ranches in the territory." "Then we need leverage," Matthew mused. "Something to make him reconsider." Abigail laughed without humor. "Unless you've got $5,000 hidden in your saddlebags, I don't see what leverage we could possibly have." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the glow of the lantern light. "Maybe not money," he said slowly, "but information." "What kind of information?" "The kind that might change how people see Hollister." Matthew leaned forward, his voice dropping even though there was no one else to hear. "When I was in Santa Fe, I ran into an old acquaintance, a man who used to work for the territorial governor. He mentioned something about bank irregularities in several towns, including Hachita. Seems some bankers have been manipulating loan terms, charging higher interest than allowed by law." Abigail frowned. "Are you suggesting Hollister might be doing that?" "It's worth looking into," Matthew said. If we could prove he's been operating outside the law, it might give us the time we need. The idea was both appealing and frightening. Going against the most powerful man in Hachita was risky, but if it could save the ranch. How would we even find out? She asked. Your husband's loan documents, Matthew suggested. Do you still have them? Abigail nodded. In his desk. But I've looked at them, they're all legal documents with Hollister's signature. Sometimes the devil's in the details, Matthew said. Mind if I take a look? They moved inside, and Abigail brought out the stack of papers from Thomas's desk. Matthew spread them out on the table, his brow furrowed in concentration as he examined each document. Here, he said after nearly an hour, pointing to a clause in one of the earlier loans. And here. He indicated another document. The interest rates don't match what's in the later agreements, and they're higher than what's allowed by territorial law. And look at these payment records. Some of your husband's payments seem to have been applied to interest only, not principal, even though the terms say otherwise. Abigail leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against Matthew's as she peered at the documents. Are you saying he cheated us? I'm saying there are discrepancies that a judge might find interesting, Matthew replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. Hollister's been taking advantage of your husband's trust, and now he's trying to do the same to you. Abigail sat back, a mix of outrage and hope surging through her. Can we prove it? These documents are a start, Matthew said, but we need more. We need to know if he's done this to others. The next day, while Abigail tended to the ranch and their lodgers, Matthew rode into town. He returned late in the afternoon, his expression grimly satisfied. Talked to 3 other ranchers who have taken loans from Hollister, he reported as he unsaddled his horse. All of them had similar experiences, interest rates that seemed to change, payments that didn't reduce the principal as they should have. One man, Jenkins, lost his place last year, said the amount he owed somehow doubled in the span of 6 months. So Hollister's been doing this systematically, Abigail said, her hands clenching into fists. Cheating people out of their land. Looks that way, and there's more. Matthew lowered his voice, though Emma was inside with one of the travelers' wives who had offered to teach the girl to knit. I sent a telegram to that friend in Santa Fe. There's a territorial bank inspector due to visit next month. If we can hold off Hollister until then, we might be able to expose him. But the deadline is in 2 weeks, Abigail reminded him. Matthew nodded. Which is why we're going to see Hollister tomorrow, together. The following morning, they dressed in their best clothes, Abigail in her one good dress, a deep blue that Thomas had always said brought out her eyes, and Matthew in a clean shirt and vest, his normally unruly hair slicked back with water. They left Emma with Mrs. Prescott and rode into town, their plan rehearsed, but their nerves on edge. The Hachita Bank was the most imposing building in town, a 2-story structure of red brick with large windows and ornate trim. Inside, the cool, quiet atmosphere spoke of money and power. The teller, a young man with spectacles, seemed surprised to see them. Mrs. Rose, Mr. Lawson, he greeted them. What can I do for you today? We're here to see Mr. Hollister, Abigail said, her voice steadier than she felt. Regarding the Rose Ranch loan, the teller hesitated. Mr. Hollister is quite busy this morning. He'll see us, Matthew said firmly. Tell him it's about certain irregularities we've discovered in the loan documents. The teller's eyes widened and he scurried to the back office. A moment later, Hollister himself appeared, his thin face set in a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Rose, he said, ignoring Matthew completely. What's this about irregularities? I assure you, all your husband's loans were properly documented and executed. Perhaps we could discuss this in private, Mr. Hollister, Abigail suggested, aware of the curious looks from the other bank employees. Hollister's smile tightened, but he nodded. Of course. Please come to my office. The banker's office was opulent compared to the rest of Hachita, a large mahogany desk, plush chairs, and a cabinet that Abigail suspected contained fine liquor. Hollister seated himself behind the desk, but did not invite them to sit. Now, what's this nonsense about irregularities? He demanded. His pretense at politeness evaporating, Matthew placed the stack of loan documents on the desk. These loans show interest rates that exceed territorial limits, Mr. Hollister. And the payment records indicate that you've been misapplying funds, ensuring that the principal balance barely decreases despite regular payments. Hollister's face reddened. How dare you come into my bank with these accusations? Who do you think you are, sir? Some drifter who's attached himself to a widow with a failing ranch. I'm someone who knows the law, Matthew replied calmly. And someone who's spoken to other ranchers you've cheated. Jenkins, Miller, Sandoval, all of them have similar stories. All of them lost land that should have been rightfully theirs. This is preposterous, Hollister sputtered. You have no proof. We have enough to interest the territorial bank inspector, Abigail cut in. The one who's due here next month. That got Hollister's attention. His face paled slightly. What do you want? An extension, Abigail said promptly. 6 more months to repay the loan at a fair and legal interest rate, and a recalculation of what we actually owe based on the proper application of all past payments. Hollister's eyes narrowed. And if I refuse? Then we take these documents and our concerns to Sheriff Tanner, Matthew said. And to Judge Wilson when he comes through next week, and to the territorial inspector when he arrives, and to anyone else who might be interested in how the Hachita Bank conducts its business. The room was silent as Hollister considered his options. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a calculating look replacing his anger. 3 months, he offered, and I'll review the payment records. 6 months, Abigail countered. A full accounting of all payments made with proper interest calculations, and written confirmation that no foreclosure proceedings will begin during that time. Hollister's jaw tightened, but after a moment he nodded. Very well, I'll have the papers drawn up by tomorrow. Today, Matthew insisted. We'll wait. 2 hours later, they rode out of town with a new agreement in hand, one that gave them the time they needed and reduced their debt to a still substantial but more manageable $5,000. It was a victory, but a tenuous one. He'll look for ways to undermine us, Abigail said as they rode home. This isn't over. No, Matthew agreed, but it's a start, and now we have time to implement the rest of our plan. Over the next few months, the Rose Ranch slowly transformed. The way station business grew, with travelers spreading the word about the clean lodging and good food to be had at the widow Rose's place. The cattle they'd purchased began to fatten on the rich grass, and Matthew's careful management ensured that the herd remained healthy and growing. Word of Hollister's questionable practices spread, too, despite his efforts to suppress it. The territorial inspector did indeed arrive, and though Hollister managed to cover most of his tracks, the scrutiny forced him to operate more cautiously. Several ranchers, emboldened by the Rose Ranch's stand, began to challenge their own loan terms. Through it all, Matthew remained by Abigail's side, working from dawn until dusk, teaching Emma to ride and rope, sharing quiet evenings on the porch with Abigail. Their partnership deepened into friendship, and friendship into something more unspoken, but growing stronger with each passing day. It was Emma who first gave voice to what was happening. One evening, as Matthew was teaching her to whittle under Abigail's watchful eye to ensure she didn't cut herself, the little girl looked up at him with her serious blue eyes. "Are you going to be my new papa?" she asked bluntly. Matthew's hands stilled on the piece of wood he was shaping. He glanced at Abigail, whose face had flushed a deep red. "Emma Rose," Abigail scolded gently, "that's not a proper question to ask." "Why not?" Emma persisted. "You smile when he's around, Mama, and he looks at you the way Papa used to." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken feelings. Finally, Matthew cleared his throat. "That would be up to your mama, Miss Emma, and it's not something that should be rushed." Emma seemed to consider this. "But you're not leaving, are you? You promised to help us keep the ranch." "I promised," Matthew confirmed, "and I keep my promises." Later, after Emma was asleep, Abigail found Matthew on the porch in his usual spot. She sat beside him, closer than usual, their shoulders nearly touching. "I'm sorry about Emma's question," she said softly. "She's at an age where she speaks her mind without thinking." "No need to apologize," Matthew replied. "Children often see things most clearly." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious in the moonlight. "She wasn't wrong about how I look at you, Abigail." Abigail's heart quickened. "Matthew, you don't have to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know it's too soon. Your husband's only been gone a few months and you're still grieving. I respect that. I just wanted you to know that I'm not here just for the ranch or out of some sense of duty. I'm here because of you and Emma. Because being here feels right in a way nothing has in a very long time." Abigail looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "When Thomas died, I thought my life was over, not just because of the debt, but because I couldn't imagine going on without him. He was everything to me." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But these past months working with you, seeing how you are with Emma, how hard you've fought for this place, it's made me realize that life does go on, that maybe there can be happiness again." Matthew reached out slowly and covered her hands with one of his. "There's no rush, Abigail, we have time now." She turned her hand over to clasp his, a simple gesture that felt momentous. "Yes," she agreed, "we have time." As summer turned to fall, the Rose Ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. The Travelers' Way station now operated at capacity most nights, with Abigail's reputation as a fine cook drawing people from miles around. The cattle herd had grown to 50 head, with several calves born in the spring now thriving. By the time the 6-month extension was nearing its end, they had managed to save nearly $3,000, still short of what they needed, but a remarkable achievement given where they'd started. "We need another $1,500 to meet the terms," Abigail calculated one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, account books spread before them. "The cattle drive coming through next week will need hands. If you go with them as far as Santa Fe, that could bring in a couple hundred." Matthew nodded, making a note in the ledger. "And there's that family from back east looking to buy breeding stock. If we sell them 10 head at the price they are offering, that's another 1,000. Which still leaves us short," Abigail sighed. Unless what?" Abigail hesitated, then reached for a letter that had arrived the previous day. "I got an offer from Mr. Hargrove at the hotel in town. He wants to buy my pies and bread exclusively for his dining room. It would mean getting up even earlier to bake enough for both the way station and the hotel, but the money would be steady." Matthew frowned. "You're already working from dawn till dusk, Abigail. Taking on more would be too much." "Not if it means keeping the ranch," she insisted. "We're so close, Matthew, I can't give up now." He studied her face, noting the determination in her eyes, the same spirit that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "All right," he conceded, "but only if you let me help with the baking. I make a passable biscuit, you know." Abigail laughed, the sound warming the kitchen. "You, Matthew Lawson, are a man of many talents." "Only trying to keep up with you," he replied with a smile. The days that followed were busier than ever. Matthew joined the cattle drive as planned, returning a week later with $250 for his work. The Eastern family purchased 12 head instead of 10, bringing in an additional 200 beyond what they'd expected. And Abigail's arrangement with the hotel proved even more profitable than anticipated when word of her baking spread to other establishments in town. By the time Hollister's deadline arrived, they had the full amount ready, $5,000 in cash and bank drafts, carefully counted and recounted. They rode into town together, Emma between them on her own small pony, a gift from Matthew that he'd trained specially for her. The little girl had insisted on coming, saying she wanted to see the bad banker's face when we win. Hollister was clearly surprised to see them walk into the bank with confident expressions. His surprise turned to barely concealed anger when Abigail placed the money on his desk. $5,000, she said. "The full amount owed as per our agreement. I believe that concludes our business, Mr. Hollister." The banker counted the money slowly, as if hoping to find it short. When he could find no discrepancy, he looked up with a cold smile. "It seems congratulations are in order, Mrs. Rose. Though I must say I'm surprised. Not many widows manage to save their property, especially one as encumbered as yours was." "I had help," Abigail said simply, placing her hand on Emma's shoulder and glancing at Matthew. "Yes, I can see that," Hollister replied, his eyes flickering to Matthew with undisguised dislike. "Well, as you say, our business is concluded, the debt is paid, the Rose Ranch remains yours." "I'd like that in writing," Matthew said. "A clear statement that the debt is satisfied in full, with no further claims against the property." Hollister's smile tightened, but he nodded to his clerk, who began preparing the document. While they waited, Emma wandered to the window, pressing her nose against the glass to watch the street outside. "Mama, look," she called suddenly. "There's a circus coming." Sure enough, a colorful wagon was rolling down Hachita's Main Street, emblazoned with the words Professor Willoughby's Traveling Wonder Show. Several similarly decorated wagons followed, drawing a crowd of curious onlookers. "Can we go see, Mama, please?" Emma begged, bouncing on her toes. Abigail looked to Matthew, who grinned. "Seems like a fine way to celebrate," he suggested. With the debt satisfaction document safely tucked into Abigail's reticule, they joined the growing crowd on the street. Professor Willoughby, a rotund man with an impressive waxed mustache, was announcing that his show would perform that evening in the field just outside town. "Acrobats, trained animals, feats of strength and daring," he proclaimed. "A show unlike any you've seen before." Emma's eyes were wide with excitement. "Can we go to the show? Please, Mama, please, Matthew," Abigail laughed, caught up in her daughter's enthusiasm and the relief of finally being free from Hollister's shadow. "Yes, I think we've earned a night of entertainment." They spent the afternoon in town, treating Emma to candy from the general store and browsing through the latest goods that had arrived on the eastbound stage. By the time they headed to the circus grounds that evening, Emma was nearly bursting with anticipation. The show was indeed impressive for a small traveling troupe. Acrobats performed daring feats on a makeshift trapeze, a trained bear danced to the music of a wheezing accordion, and Professor Willoughby himself demonstrated various scientific wonders that drew gasps from the audience. But it was during the final act, a horseback riding display by a young woman in a spangled costume, that something unexpected happened. As the rider performed her tricks, standing upright on the back of her galloping horse, the animal suddenly shied at something in the crowd. The woman wobbled, trying to maintain her balance, but then pitched sideways toward the ground. Matthew moved without thinking, vaulting over the rope that separated the audience from the performance ring. He reached the falling woman just in time, catching her before she hit the ground. The crowd erupted in applause, thinking it part of the show, but Abigail could see from Matthew's face that the rescue had been genuine. The rider, a pretty young woman with dark hair, clung to Matthew for a moment longer than necessary before he set her carefully on her feet. She said something to him that Abigail couldn't hear over the crowd, then curtsied dramatically to the audience before leading her horse from the ring. When Matthew returned to his seat beside Abigail and Emma, his face was flushed with embarrassment at being the center of attention. "That was amazing," Emma exclaimed. "You saved her, Matthew." "Just happened to be in the right place," he demurred. "Anyone would have done the same." But Abigail had noticed the way the performer had looked at Matthew, and a small, irrational pang of jealousy shot through her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, not since the early days with Thomas, when a pretty girl from a neighboring ranch had set her cap for him. After the show, as they were preparing to leave, one of the circus hands approached them. "Professor Willoughby would like to thank the gentleman who assisted our rider," he said. "If you'd come this way." Matthew looked to Abigail, who nodded, though she felt an odd reluctance. They followed the man to the largest wagon, where Professor Willoughby greeted them effusively. "Extraordinary reflexes, my good man," he boomed, pumping Matthew's hand. Truly extraordinary, Flora might have been seriously injured if not for your quick thinking. It was nothing, Matthew insisted, just glad I could help. Nothing, it was everything. A musical voice joined the conversation as the rider herself appeared from behind the wagon. She had changed from her performance costume into a simple dress, though she was still striking with her olive skin and dark, flashing eyes. You saved me from a nasty fall, sir. I am in your debt. No debt necessary, miss, Matthew said, his tone polite but reserved. I'm just glad you weren't hurt. The woman Flora smiled warmly at him, then turned her attention to Abigail and Emma. And this must be your family. What a lovely daughter you have. Oh, we're not, Abigail began, but Emma cut her off. Matthew's going to be my new papa, she announced with the certainty of a child. He saved our ranch just like he saved you. Flora's eyebrows rose, and she looked between Abigail and Matthew with new interest. Is that so? How romantic. Her smile didn't diminish, but something in her eyes changed, a slight cooling that Abigail couldn't help but feel pleased about. We should be heading back, Matthew said, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. It's getting late and someone has chores in the morning. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, Emma eventually dozed off in her saddle, secure in the special harness Matthew had crafted to keep her safe. Abigail watched as he occasionally reached over to steady the sleeping child, his movements careful and protective. You were quite the hero tonight, she said softly. Emma's going to be telling that story for weeks, Matthew chuckled. It wasn't anything special, just instinct. The circus lady seemed to think it was special, Abigail observed, trying to keep her tone light. Flora was it. Matthew glanced at her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Abigail Rose, if I didn't know better, I'd think you were jealous. Don't be ridiculous, she scoffed, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. I'm merely making conversation, he hummed, unconvinced. After a moment he added more seriously, she's not my type. Oh, Abigail couldn't help asking, and what is your type, Mr. Lawson? Matthew was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and earnest. Someone strong. Someone who faces life's hardships with courage and grace. Someone who puts others first but isn't afraid to fight for what matters. He looked directly at her. Someone like you, Abigail. The simple honesty of his words took her breath away. Matthew. I know it hasn't been that long, he continued. And I know you're still healing from losing Thomas, but I can't help how I feel, Abigail. These past months working alongside you, watching you with Emma, seeing your determination and spirit, I've fallen in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, as vast and sparkling as the star-filled sky above. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope, and something else, something that felt dangerously like happiness. I don't expect anything, Matthew added quickly when she didn't immediately respond. I just wanted you to know. Now that the ranch is secure, if you want me to move on, no, Abigail interrupted, the word coming out more forcefully than she'd intended. No, I don't want you to move on, Matthew. She took a deep breath. When Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. I never expected to feel this way again. And how is it that you feel? He asked softly. Abigail met his gaze in the moonlight. Alive, she whispered. You make me feel alive again, Matthew. And scared and hopeful and, yes, sometimes even jealous of pretty circus performers. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming it in the silver light. I only have eyes for one woman, Abigail Rose, have since the day I rode onto your ranch. They reached home shortly after, putting Emma to bed before returning to their usual spot on the porch. But tonight, something had changed. The space between them seemed charged with possibility. What happens now? Abigail asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Whatever you want to happen, Matthew replied. I'm not going anywhere unless you ask me to. The ranch is on solid footing now, but there's still plenty of work to be done. And Emma's pony needs regular training. Abigail smiled. You're very good with her, you know. She adores you. The feeling's mutual. Matthew's expression grew serious. I never thought much about having a family of my own. The life I've led, always moving, never settling. It didn't seem possible, but now. Now, she prompted when he trailed off. Now I can't imagine being anywhere but here. With you and Emma. Abigail reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. Then stay, she said simply. Stay and help me build something here, something that's ours. The look he gave her was full of such tender hope that it made her heart ache. I'd like that very much, he said. But Abigail, I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to replace Thomas. I know he'll always have a place in your heart and in Emma's memories. Yes, he will, Abigail acknowledged, but the heart has room for more than one love. Thomas taught me how to love, how to build a life with someone. Losing him taught me how precious that is and how quickly it can be taken away. She squeezed his hand. I don't want to waste any more time being afraid to feel again. Matthew's other hand came up to cup her cheek gently. May I kiss you, Abigail Rose? He asked, his voice husky. In answer, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tender at first, a careful exploration, but quickly deepened into something more, a promise, a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Well, Matthew said, his dimple appearing as he smiled, that was worth waiting for. Abigail laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. Indeed it was, Mr. Lawson. The next morning, Emma found them in the kitchen, Matthew helping Abigail prepare breakfast with a newfound ease between them that was impossible to hide. The little girl observed them for a long moment, her head tilted to one side, before breaking into a wide grin. You kissed him, didn't you, Mama? She asked triumphantly. Abigail nearly dropped the plate she was holding. Emma Rose, what a question, you did. Emma clapped her hands in delight. I knew it. I told Maria Jenkins that you would, and she said her mama says widows don't get new husbands, but I said you would because Matthew loves us and we love him. Matthew caught Abigail's eye over Emma's head, his expression a mix of amusement and something deeper. Your mama and I are fond of each other, he said carefully. But these things take time, Miss Emma. How much time? Emma demanded. 'Cause I already waited a real long time, and I want you to be my papa for real, not just because you're helping with the ranch. Emma, Abigail began, but Matthew held up a hand. It's all right, he said, then knelt down to Emma's level. The truth is, Miss Emma, I'd be honored to be your papa someday, but that's a decision your mama and I need to make together, and it's not something to rush into. Emma considered this. But you do want to. Very much, Matthew confirmed. More than anything. This seemed to satisfy the girl, who nodded solemnly. Good, 'cause I already told everyone at school that you're staying forever. With that bombshell delivered, she skipped off to wash up for breakfast, leaving the adults to exchange bemused glances. Out of the mouths of babes, Abigail murmured. I'm sorry if she put you on the spot. She didn't, Matthew assured her. I meant what I said. I would be honored to be her father someday, and your husband if you'll have me. Abigail's heart swelled at the sincerity in his voice. I think that's something we can work toward, Mr. Lawson, but Emma's right about one thing, you are staying forever, aren't you? Wild horses couldn't drag me away, he promised. The following months brought changes both large and small to the Rose Ranch. With the bank debt fully paid, they were able to reinvest their profits into expanding the operation. The waystation business continued to thrive, with Abigail's reputation as both a hostess and a cook spreading throughout the territory. Matthew's expertise with cattle led to a steadily growing herd, now numbering over 70 head, with plans to reach 100 by the following spring. Hachita itself was changing too. The railroad was pushing ever closer, bringing new settlers and opportunities. The town's population had nearly doubled in the past year, and with growth came increased demand for services and goods that the Rose Ranch was well positioned to provide. But the most significant changes were personal. Matthew and Abigail's relationship deepened with each passing day, their partnership expanding beyond the running of the ranch to encompass all aspects of their lives. They moved cautiously but steadily toward a future together, mindful of Emma's eager anticipation, but determined to build a solid foundation first. It was a year to the day after Thomas's death that Matthew formally asked Abigail to marry him. They were on the porch in their usual spots, watching the sun set over the hills that marked the boundary of their land. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice casual though his hands betrayed his nervousness, fidgeting with a small object she couldn't quite see. "A dangerous pastime," Abigail teased, having grown comfortable enough with him to joke freely. "Indeed," he agreed with a smile. "Especially when the thoughts are about how completely my life has changed since I rode onto this ranch a year ago, how I came looking for work and found a home instead. How I met a woman who reminded me what it means to fight for something worthwhile." Abigail's breath caught in her throat as Matthew slid from his chair to one knee beside her, holding out a simple gold ring. "I love you, Abigail Rose," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "You and Emma have become my whole world. I know it's been exactly a year since you lost Thomas, and if you need more time, I understand. But I wanted you to know that whenever you're ready, I'm here, asking you to be my wife." Tears filled Abigail's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "A year ago today, I thought my life was over," she said softly. "I couldn't see a path forward through the grief and the fear and the debt. And then you arrived, like some answer to a prayer I hadn't even known to make." She reached out to cup his cheek, her touch gentle. "You never asked for anything in return for your help. You just gave and gave of your time, your strength, your knowledge. You helped me save this ranch, but more importantly, you helped me find hope again." "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Matthew Lawson," she replied, her smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, though she had no idea how he'd managed that, and then rose to pull her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. "I was so afraid you'd think it was too soon," he admitted when they finally broke apart. "That asking you on the anniversary of his death would seem disrespectful." Abigail shook her head. "Thomas would have approved, you know. He always said if anything happened to him, he hoped I'd find someone who would look after Emma and me, someone good and kind and strong." She touched the ring, which caught the last rays of the setting sun. "You're all those things and more, Matthew. I think, in a way, he sent you to us." "Then I owe him a debt I can never repay," Matthew said solemnly. A small voice interrupted them from the doorway. "Did you ask her?" "Did Mama say yes?" They turned to find Emma watching them, her expression hopeful. Matthew grinned and nodded, and the little girl launched herself at them with a squeal of delight, nearly knocking them both over in her enthusiasm. I knew it, she chanted, hugging them both fiercely. "When can we tell everyone? When's the wedding? Can I be the flower girl? Can I—" "Whoa there," Matthew laughed, steadying her. "One question at a time, Miss Emma. Yes, you can be the flower girl, and we haven't decided on a date yet, but it won't be too long. Right, Abigail?" "Right," she confirmed, her heart full to bursting at the sight of her daughter's happiness and the love shining in her fiancé's eyes. "But we should probably wait until after the cattle drive next month. We'll be too busy until then to plan properly. And then you'll really, truly be my papa." Emma asked Matthew, her expression suddenly serious. "Really and truly," he promised, kneeling down to her level. "If that's what you want." "It's what I've wanted forever," she declared, throwing her arms around his neck. "And I'm going to be the best daughter ever, I promise." "You already are," Matthew told her, his voice thick with emotion as he hugged her back. Later that night, after Emma had finally been persuaded to go to bed, though not before extracting promises about the wedding dress she would wear and the cake they would have, Abigail and Matthew stood together under the stars, his arm around her waist. "Are you happy?" he asked, looking down at her with such tenderness that it made her heart ache. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," she replied honestly. "A year ago, I was drowning in grief and debt with no way out. Now the ranch is thriving, Emma is flourishing, and I'm engaged to a man who came into our lives and asked for nothing but gave us everything. Not everything, Matthew corrected gently. You saved yourselves, Abigail, you and Emma. I just helped a little along the way. More than a little, she insisted. But that's what partners do, isn't it? Help each other, build something together. Partners, he agreed, pulling her closer, in all things, now and always. As they sealed this promise with a kiss, Abigail knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, she, Matthew, and Emma. A family forged not just by blood but by choice, by love, and by the determination to build something that would last. The ranch that had once been a burden had become the foundation of their future, a legacy they would continue to build together, day by day, year by year. And as for the debts that had once threatened to consume her, they were nothing but a distant memory now, replaced by a wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars, the richness of a life filled with love, with purpose, and with the kind of happiness that comes from finding your way home, even when you thought the path was lost forever.